While all these new arrangements were being made at a rapid pace, the usual work of the Coordinators Committee office didn't stop because of the pandemic. We still had to deal with the King of the North persecuting our brothers. We still had disasters and many other things to contend with.
In fact, we handled twice as many disasters in the 2020 service year, in the middle of the pandemic, than we did in 2018. On a daily basis, we saw clear evidence that we are living in the last days.
We had to come up with guidelines to help branches determine what aspects of relief work could be postponed, and at the same time ensure that urgent or necessary work went ahead safely. While there's no doubt that the pandemic complicated disaster relief efforts considerably, it was so faith-strengthening to see that the governing body refused to allow those complications to prevent them from caring for our brothers.
In addition to the impact these disasters had on our brothers, in some countries, our brothers couldn't even get enough food for their daily needs. This could have been because of government restrictions, supply issues, or other circumstances that wouldn't allow the brothers to work. Literally, the branches had to arrange to provide their daily bread.
Branches were encouraged to establish disaster relief committees to care for the needs on a local level. Reminders were provided to help families try to prepare a reserve of food, if at all possible, in case the situation became worse.
Apparently, the only way to get through a disaster is to be a Jehovah's Witness. If you're living anywhere in the world where there's a disaster, where there's an extreme weather event, where there's some kind of, government coup, or some kind of earthquake, or whatever, if you're not one of Jehovah's Witnesses, you're toast. Because only in the Jehovah's Witness organization are people taken care of. That's the message I'm getting towards the end there. And I can speak a little bit about the response to disasters, and we'll come to whether they're proof of the last days, by the way. But I can speak a little bit about the response to disasters because we heard there Todd Ellison of the Coordinators Committee office saying this.
In some countries, our brothers couldn't even get enough food for their daily needs. This could have been because of government restrictions, supply issues, or other circumstances that wouldn't allow the brothers to work. Literally, the branches had to arrange to provide their daily bread.
I lived through a disaster involving Jehovah's Witnesses. Our house got hit by a 6 magnitude earthquake, and we live with Jehovah's Witnesses. So we saw firsthand what happened. This was December of 2020. It may not have been the 2020 service year, but nevertheless, it was a disaster. And the organization responded to it, and we saw the way they responded. So I have first-hand experience of what happened, or what has happened in a disaster where Jehovah's Witnesses are involved. And I can tell you, my wife's parents were not dependent on the organization. That's the message I'm picking up here. That if food hadn't been provided, if daily bread hadn't been provided, people would have starved. I think that's incredibly disingenuous to suggest that, at least based on my experience, where a disaster hit our part of Croatia, again, 6 magnitude earthquake, our area was bombarded with humanitarian support. In fact, me, my wife, and my children were fleeing that same day that the earthquake struck. And the line of traffic, we were expecting there to be a line of traffic out of our area. In fact, the line of traffic was coming into our area. The road was completely bumper to bumper traffic flooding into the Sisak Petrinja area, because people from all parts of the country were responding to the disaster and were flooding in. In fact, they had the problem that they had was that too many people were flooding into the area. That was hampering rescue efforts. Such was the response, such was the willingness from worldly people that Jehovah's Witnesses believe deserve to die at Armageddon. Such was the response of worldly people that the roads were jammed, and it was actually harder to get the people who needed help the help that they needed. But in terms of food, my in-laws were okay for food. They were fine for food, but they still had food brought for them. And you could say, well, that's something, that's brilliant. Yes, I suppose it's something, but again, it's not like they were dependent on it. It was more, if anything, dare I say, a token gesture. We want to be involved in this situation. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are many parts of the world where aid agencies aren't able to do as much. I'm sure I can envision situations where perhaps Jehovah's Witnesses have been more dependent on the organization for help. But I haven't seen that in our disaster, the disaster that affected our part of the world. And more to the point, I'm not sure how you can point to aid efforts by religious organizations as being anything special, as being proof that they're being used by God. Because then you have to apply the same rule, the same logic to any aid agency or any religious charity. Frankly, so many of the charities that provide humanitarian support are religious. They're some denomination or other. And Jehovah's Witnesses are one of many doing this. But in this propaganda, this slick propaganda segment, they're trying to give this impression that everything hinges on them, and when a disaster strikes, it's Jehovah's Witnesses to the rescue. I'm sorry, they're just not as important in that situation as they're making out. And as I've repeatedly said, the aid is for believers. The aid is for followers. If a non-Jehovah's Witness receives this aid, it's coincidentally. The aid is primarily targeted at fellow believers, and how is that anything special? As the scriptures say, if you only show love among yourselves, you're only doing what the people of the nations are doing, or however it's said. However the verse goes. I've used these scriptures so many times. There's also the verse, let your left hand not know what your right hand is doing. The scriptures will flash up on the screen if Tibor is gracious. I'm trying not to repeat myself, but they keep pushing these bad arguments. And another bad argument they're pushing on this particular occasion is the notion that disasters are intensifying because we're in the last days.
In fact, we handled twice as many disasters in the 2020 service year, in the middle of the pandemic, than we did in 2018. On a daily basis, we saw clear evidence that we are living in the last days.
Chad, that's not evidence that we're living in the last days. Extreme weather events intensifying and increasing does not mean that we're on the cusp of an event that will lead to the world being ruled over by Stephen Lett, Tony Morris, David Splain and co. I'm sorry, have you never heard of climate change? I mean, just go on Wikipedia. If you go on the Wikipedia page, Effects of Climate Change, there is a subheading, Effects on Weather, which reads as follows. Global warming leads to an increase in extreme weather events, such as heat waves, droughts, cyclones, blizzards, and rainstorms. Such events will continue to occur more often and with greater intensity. Scientists have not only determined that climate change is responsible for trends in weather patterns, some individual extreme weather events have also directly been attributed to climate change. Surely Chad knows this. He looks like a fairly switched on guy who must watch some news, I guess, even though he's working at World Headquarters. And I'm sure has a very suspicious outlook towards the media. Surely he's aware of climate change? And yet here he is using climate change, using intensifying weather events as an opportunity, exploiting these as an opportunity to peddle misinformation and to, frankly, fearmonger, to terrify people into thinking that the situation is different than it really is, and actually these cyclones and hurricanes and tornadoes, they're really omens of the fact that Earth's rulership will soon pass over to the Messianic kingdom, and a toga-wearing Tony Morris, Stephen Let David Splain, Samuel Hurd and co. are going to be riding around on horses, killing all non-Jehovah's Witnesses, to pave the way for some kind of paradisaic utopia where everyone gets to mess around with pandas and eat watermelons. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the evidence for any of that. You're just leaping on calamity, quite frankly. And it's not just Chad. I'm not singling Chad out. He's just a mouthpiece for the organization he's working for. And quite frankly, he's probably been fed this script. But what does it say about an organization that does this? That just glosses over the fact that climate change is real and is affecting our weather, glosses over all of that, and uses extreme weather events that claim people's lives and cause death and misery, uses these as an opportunity to push their doomsday ideology.